I made this jumper dress as one of my first projects for this channel, but I never made a video because it was one of the most complicated things I'd ever made at that point, and I just couldn't figure out how to explain it. But it's been a few years now, and I think I'm ready. As a surprising number of people in the comments have guessed, the jumper was directly based off of this look worn by Clara Oswald in Doctor Who Season 9, Episode 3. At the time, there was a lot of criticism over the way Clara's character was written, but you have to admit that her costuming, at the very least, was fantastic. Iconic. I just loved everything about it. I loved everything she wore, the way it was styled, the color schemes. I loved how it was such a great blend of classy, vintage, ultra-feminine styles with like All Saints jackets and beefy boots and spiky jewelry and just really, I loved it all. I loved everything. But anyways, the jumper she wore was made by Miss Patina, and following the style's popularity based on the show, Miss Patina restocked the original jumper and other pattern variations, and as of the making of this video, it is still available for purchase. So if you want it, but the sewing is too complicated, for once I can just say, go buy it. So that's the story behind my first jumper dress, though it's been a few years, and now that I'm about to make it again, there are a few things I'd like to do differently. The biggest one is the darts. I was copying the original jumper, which only had horizontal bust darts, and that was really not a good idea for my body type, but I didn't know that at the time. One shallow dart didn't allow for nearly enough bust room, not if you want to also make the waist fitted. And so my jumper has always been too tight in consequence. I also want to reverse the buttons this time, to the left rather than the right. I want to make it longer too. At the time, I preferred shorter skirts, and I only had 1.5 yards to work with. This time I bought plenty of fabric, and I now prefer longer skirts in the winter. They're just warmer. For a minor tweak, the original has 2 little pleats on the button side of the skirt. I want to add those pleats to the other side of the skirt as well. And I want to improve my pattern matching on the collar and the waistband. At the time I was just working with the fabric I have, but let's see what we can do now. Okay, got the plan? Ready to go? Let's go! Drafting this bodice was quite a process. I think the easiest, best way for me to explain it is through diagrams, rather than trying to have you interpret my messy footage of cutting and taping and measuring paper. But let me know in the comments if you find this format easier to understand. To start, you need 4 basic patterns. You need a bodice front and back, you need a flared skirt, and you need a pocket. The skirt is my fitted half-circle skirt that I drafted in the previous video. The pocket is my Victorian-inspired pocket from a few videos back, which is sewn into the side and suspended from the waist seam by a tape. And the bodice is the block I've been working on lately, tweaking and refining it over the last few projects. It has a high neck and 2 bust darts, since the biggest problem with my last version was how flat the chest was and how tight that made it. There should be plenty of room in this version. This pattern also has ease in the side seams, since this project is for a jumper dress or a pinafore dress, and I want it to be loose enough to fit comfortably over winter sweaters. Let's begin with the bodice. First, this will be much easier if you start by marking all of your seam allowances, if they're already built into the pattern. For the neckline, I don't want it to sit this close to my neck, because I'll be wearing it over other shirts, blouses, and sweaters, and I want there to be room for those necklines and collars to show. So I'm going to trim the neck back, just by a little bit. Make sure you line up the front and back at the shoulders, to make sure that the seams have been trimmed to even lengths and will still line up correctly. Now, since the front is overlapped, it needs to be reversed and traced again, so that you have the full front pattern to work with. Good, now mark inside the seam allowance how wide you want the collar to be. I used 1 inch. Don't cut those pieces off quite yet though. Before we do that, we should work out the front edge. Draw a vertical line where you want the edge to sit. I placed mine just slightly over the line for the vertical dart so that the edge will cover it. Now use a ruler to decide where you want to cut the angle for the top of that edge and the collar. I felt it out, but I tried to make sure that where I ended it, the angle was about 1 inch wide, so that it matched the width of the collar. But you can play around with it. Now go ahead and cut the collar pieces off the front and back bodice, and add new seam allowances to all the pieces wherever you've just cut them. Let's finish off the collar. Take the front and back and line up the shoulder seams, then tape them together. Instead of side seams, we're going to add seam allowance to the center back. Now you should have markings for the center back, the shoulder seam, the center front, and the edge. The edge on the other side of the bodice, the underlapped edge, will be shorter. Fold the collar along the center front and trace the edge. Now you have to move that line in by ½ inch to account for the seam. Then add a mark where the button will go. Then add a line on the other side of the button, then move it back out by ½ inch for the seam allowance. And this will be your cutting line for the underlapped layer. This part was pretty confusing to me, and if it's messing with your head too bad, you could just skip this part and make both sides of the front the same. I didn't because I didn't want the underlapped collar to show at all, but it really wouldn't be that big of a deal if it did. Now to finish the front edge of the bodice. You could simply add seam allowance and be done, but I used a slightly complicated but so satisfying finishing method where the outer fabric folds under the bodice and forms the button placket. To do this, measure 1 inch past the fold line. Now measure ½ inch past that for seam allowance. This is where you'll cut the outer fabric. Now measure in from the fold line by ½ inch. This is where you'll cut the lining fabric. This will form a V at the top edge. Add a ½ inch of seam allowance up there too. And then that edge is done. One last thing though, the waistband. Mark 1 inch above the seam allowance and cut that off the bodice front and back. Add seam allowance to the bodice pieces and this strip. Now the bodice is done, but the waistband still needs some work. First, cut out the darts and tape the waistband back together without them. Do the same with the side seam so that the waistband is all one piece. Now mark a line ½ inch outside the front edge, and that's where you'll cut the underlapped side. For the overlapped side, the waistband extends about ½ inch further, and then it ends in a little angle. So mark the angle past the ½ inch, and then add seam allowance to that. And there's your other cutting line. Now, I would either leave the waistband as 2 pieces with a center back seam, which means that you'll need to add that seam allowance, or I could cut the waistband as 1 piece and trim off the angle on the other side so that you just have that one long strip. Okay, all bodice pieces are done, but we've still got the skirt to do. Take your pattern, and mine does include seam allowance at the top and bottom edge, but not the sides. For the back, I'll just leave one side as a fold line, and then I'll add seam allowance to the other side. For the front, the fold line will act as my center front. I do need seam allowance on the other side, but because this is a wrapped skirt, the center front is not where I'll cut the other edge. I need to measure the bodice from the center front to the fold line and then add that to my skirt. Then I'll add an extra 1.5 inches for the underfolded edge. Then I'm going to add 4 more inches for the 2 little pleats off to the side of the front. This means I need to add a total of 9 inches to the center front. Now, I didn't angle this excess, I just cut it straight out, which is usually not how you cut a standard pattern. Usually you'd want it to be an even angle all the way around. But I didn't want the pattern of the plaid to be interrupted with the curves at the waist. I want it nice and straight, so I'm going to cut it this way instead. Now, before you cut, you do want to carefully consider the pattern matching if you are working with a plaid or stripes. I want a stripe to run up the center front and the center back of the bodice. I think this will be the easiest to keep track of with the overlapping pieces. For the skirt, I'll also cut the center back fold line on a stripe. But for the front, I have those pleats to consider. So I'll cut the front edge to match wherever I end up cutting the front edge of the bodice. Also, the reason I chose my half circle skirt fullness instead of a fuller skirt is because that's the skirt that seemed like it'd be the best for pattern matching the side seams. And then for the collar and the waistband, I'm going to cut them diagonal across the bias so that they stand out nicely among the stripes. The sewing of this dress is not hard exactly. There's no single step that is particularly difficult or advanced, but as a whole, it's a pretty complex project with a lot of little steps that need to be done in just the right order. Before we stitch anything, you do need to add a bit of interfacing to the bodice fronts. I used 1-inch wide pieces and lined them up with the fold line of the bodice edge. This interfacing will help the fold stay crisp and reinforce the buttons and buttonholes later. Next, I need to fold and pin all 6 darts.
What? Is it day 4 on this project and I finally get to sew something? What even is life? What is life, Rooster Rooster? What is life? Good morning to you too.
These are sewn in the usual manner, and then the 6 lining darts are sewn as well. Then I took them to the ironing board and trimmed them down and ironed them open. I've started doing this lately, and I really like it for reducing bulk inside the seams. However, there is a downside, which we'll get into later. Then the bodice front and back pieces get stitched together at the shoulder seams. The lining gets this treatment as well, but do not sew the side seams yet. Leave those open. Then I ran a line of stay stitching right at the 1/2 inch seam allowance around the neck. This has 2 purposes. 1, it keeps that neckline from stretching out, and 2, I can then go and clip all the way around the neckline right up to the stitching, which will make inserting the collar easier later. You will also repeat this with the lining. Now we're ready to put the bodice and lining together. Already? I know, right? Place the outer and lining right sides together and line up those front edges. I know they don't look like they should line up, but I promise they do. Stitch them and then take them to the ironing board and iron the seams towards the lining. Then fold it back over and use the fold line marked by that interfacing. Fold that top V in half and pin it. Stitch down the side of that V, tacking it well. Now the bodice can be set aside for a while and we'll work on the collar. Here you do need to be careful to keep track of which side is supposed to be the outer and which side is supposed to be folded under the dress. I got this switched up last time around, which is why the old dress buttons up on the right instead of the left. But once you've double checked, you can place the 2 sides of the collar together and sew up the center back. Do the same thing with the collar lining, and then place the 2 collars right sides together and pin around the inner curve and the 2 short sides, leaving the outer curve open. Sew those 3 sides, then take it to your ironing board. Clip the corners, trim the seam, and clip around it. Then open it and iron the seams flat. Then turn it wrong sides together and iron the whole collar smooth. At this point you could also understitch, but I felt like my fabric was stable enough not to need it, and having finished it now I don't think it needed understitching. Pin together the edges of that outer curve and then stay stitch them at about 1/4 inch. Now the collar can be inserted around the neckline of the bodice. Keep in mind that the outer edge will line up with that little V we've already sewn, but the underlapped edge will stop short. Line up the center back seam, markings for the side seams, and pin everything in between. Here is where pre-clipping the neckline will really help. This is probably the hardest part of the whole project, but if you keep your pins close together, it shouldn't be too fiddly. Just make sure you pay attention to where the outer collar lines up with that V shape. Stitch all around the collar, and then check the outside, making sure that you don't have any stay stitching showing or any of your clips or any weirdness with the V shapes or the ends of the collar. If everything looks good, you can go ahead and clip the corners of each V and trim the rest of the seam down. When you iron it and smooth down that seam, it's really going to start to come to life. Next, we'll finish the arm size. Turn the bodice right sides together again and pin together the edges of the arm size. Stitch around them, clip them, and no, I didn't bother trimming them this time since they aren't such a tight space and there are no other seams overlapping them. Then you can turn the bodice right side out. This was a bit tricky because the bulk of the entire front bodice has to fit through that narrow shoulder. I really like this method of finishing sleeveless arm size, but it isn't universal. If the shoulder was any narrower or if I was using a thicker fabric, it might not have worked. Now we can finally finish that side seam. You're going to open that bodice up again, treating the outer and lining as one seam, and pin them together. Stitch those seams, iron them open, and when you fold them back down, the bodice will be finished. One last thing we'll do is line up the bottom edges of the bodice and lining and stay stitch them together. This will just make things a bit easier later on if we can treat those edges as one. So, as you can see, it's not a terribly tricky process. However, there are a lot of small steps and the order is important. But now we can set the bodice aside and turn our attention to the skirt.
Side note, I've realized that it is entirely pointless to color match thread that is going to be on the inside and be covered with linings, so I have decided to begin a lifelong endeavor to completely clear out my thread stash, which will probably never end because people keep bequeathing me their grandmother's collections too. But you know what? As much brown as I sew.
To make the skirt, I'm first going to set my pockets. This is simple. I just place a pocket piece on each of my side seams exactly 3.5 inches from the top edge, and then stitch them in place. Make sure you iron each step as you go. It'll just help things come together smoothly. Now line up the side seams, placing each skirt front right sides together with the skirt back. Pin up the side seam, but mark and leave open a 6-inch gap at the top of the pocket. Then pin around the pocket as well and add a little strip of tape to tack into the waistband later, which will suspend the finished pocket and support the weight of the things you put in it. It all looks quite complicated, but here's how I sew it in one sweep. Start at the bottom, stitch up, right inside the line of stitching from the pocket, stop at the pocket opening and reverse yourself 180 degrees. Go back down to the bottom of the pocket, or a 1/2 inch from the bottom, turn 90 degrees and stitch around the edge of the pocket. at the top corner, so right on that tape all the way to the top edge, and then turn around and go back down 1/2 inch. So across the top of the pocket and over the seam allowance, and then turn 90 degrees again and stitch up the last few inches of the skirt side. See, it's not nearly as complicated as it looks, and I swear these are the strongest pockets you could ask for. Now, the lining is not nearly as complicated. Just pin the skirt fronts to the skirt back, sew them together, and iron those seams open. Now, the skirts could be simply sewn together and turned right side out, but as I mentioned when I was patterning the skirt, I left a 1.5 inch excess on the front edge so that I could fold it under like I did the bodice edge. I'd like to do that with the skirt hem as well, and give it a mitered corner. So first I need to trim 1.5 inches off of the lining front edge and hem. And then on the bottom corners of the lining, mark a little X, 1/2 inch from the front edge and the bottom edge. Now there is one more thing I need to do to prep the outer skirt before I sew them together. Since I trimmed the bottom edge of the lining, it's not going to fit the outer fabric anymore. So I ran a basting stitch around the outer bottom edge, and I found that just running that stitch was all I needed to do. It eased in the edge just the perfect amount to line it up with the lining. So, to pair them together, place the skirts right sides together and then, starting at the top, pin down the front edges. The lining will stop short of the outer, but that's okay. Sew these edges, but remember to stop when you hit the center of that X and back tack. Good, now do the same thing for the bottom edge. Line up the center fronts, the center back, and the side seams, and pin in between to ease those edges together. There will be excess again at the bottom corner, forming a little triangle wedge, but you can just fold and pin that out of the way for now. Sew around the bottom, back tacking at the X. Now you just need to sew down that triangle and miter the corner. I sewed it at approximately a 90-degree angle, but that wasn't quite sharp enough. It probably would have been better if I had laid it out flat on a table and just marked where the triangle wanted to sit, but it wasn't a big enough problem for me to go back and try and redo. Clip around the skirt hem, clip the corners of the mitered edge, and turn the skirt right side out. Line up the top edges, starting with the centers and sides, and then flattening out the overhang on the front edge. Then baste the waistline together, like we did with the bodice. Okay, now the bodice and skirt are finished, and all that's left is to make the waistband and then join them together. I do really like this kind of construction. Sometimes it's nice to be able to break a project down into little finished categories, and I think it does help with the adjustability later on. Okay, the waistband and the buttons. For the waistband, last time I didn't interface it, but this time, because I cut it on a very stretchy bias, I felt like it really did need to be interfaced. But after that, I lined it up with the bodice, matching the pointed end with the outer side of the bodice and the straight end with the underlay. I pinned them together, letting the pointed end overhang the bodice by that extra 1/2 inch. Then on the other side, I lined up and pinned down the waistband lining. Then I realized that I ought to sew the ends of the two waistbands together first. If you're doing this at home, feel free to do this part before you pin it to the bodice, but on the straight end, I simply stitched a small seam 1/2 inch from the edge. On the pointed end, I sewed a little house shape, starting 1/2 inch in, back tacking and sewing around the point, then coming back 1/2 inch on the other side. Then pin the bodice inside, folding the allowance of the straight end back over the seam. Stitch across that waistband, meeting up with the house shape at the pointed end. Clip the corners of the house, then turn the waistband down and press out the corners of the point. Now for the skirt. Line it up over the outer edge of the waistband and begin by pinning together the side seams and the center back. Pin in between until the entire back is pinned. For the front, it's a little fiddly to fold that peak out of the way, but do your best and line up the edge of the skirt with the end of the waistband and then pin out until you reach the center front. At this point, you'll see that the skirt is larger than the waistband and you'll be confused for a minute, but then you'll remember that we still have to do the pleats. I folded the center front to the side seam and used that to find and mark the center of the waistband and the skirt between them. Then I pinned those centers together. The excess skirt fullness was folded into a back-facing pleat on either side of that pin, about 1 inch wide, and then pinned down with the rest of the skirt. Now would be an excellent moment to pop the stay stitching holding the two skirt layers together and pull up that pocket tape. I forgot again and had to go back and do that later. I love this pocket method, but I've yet to figure out a convenient way to do it with pleated and gathered skirts. It's definitely easiest with fitted waist skirts. But anyways, at this point you can sew the skirt to the waistband, being careful to only catch the waistband outer, not the lining, and to make sure that by the time your seam hits the house shape, it meets up perfectly with the end of your house seam. Mine was over 1/8 of an inch off, and I did have to redo it a couple times. But once that's done, I trimmed the seams inside the waistband by about half, and then folded the waistband liner down to cover all the seams. I pinned it in place and then felled the lining down. And that is the first hand stitching I've had to do with this project. Not that I hate hand stitching, but I was really relieved to do a project with so little for once. Then I was down to the closures, and I didn't have 6 matching buttons in my stash that would work. So I went to Joann's, and every button was either the wrong size, or too dark, or too gray. Normally I wouldn't be so picky about buttons, but they're kind of like a feature on this dress. So I ordered some online, but that meant that I had to wait almost a full week before I could finish. To place the buttons, I started by lining up the bodice fronts using the stripes. I measured the length of the edge and divided it into 4 buttons. There will also be the button on the collar and one slightly offset from the others on the waistband. I marked those with pins, and on the other side I marked a place on the waistband and at the top of the bodice were also snaps inside the dress to keep those in place. I split the 2 sides, marking the center of each button on the underlay and the buttonholes on the overlay. Off camera, because I was super done with this project by this point, I sewed on all 6 buttons, 2 snaps, and 6 buttonholes. And we done. You know, I think I have the fewest criticisms of this project that I've ever had. Though it is a repeat project, so you would hope that I would have worked out the kinks. But here is what I did notice. The bust is nice and spacious. Perfect. But the waistband is slightly tight. It's not too tight, it's not uncomfortable, but it's not as roomy as I was aiming for. I think I might have just cut slightly too much off the base pattern since the last time I used it, so I'll have to go back and correct that. I might actually redo the whole waistband. I'll wear it a few times first and then decide if it'd be worth the effort, but the fit is just so close to perfect that I might do it. Okay, the vertical dart. There's nothing actually wrong with it, but I don't love how it eats the stripe right here. I realized later that it would have been so cool and so satisfying if I'd split it into 2 darts, one on either side of that stripe, so that it would have had that stripes narrowing in effect. That would have just been delicious. I would have gone back and redone them, except that I had already trimmed the darts on the inside. Dang, that's the thing about pattern matching. You can learn how to do it on a technical level, but it really is art, and the way you use it will be unique to each fabric and each project. And I guess it's the kind of thing that you just develop better foresight for over many projects. And another thing that's not a huge problem but worth mentioning is that the way I treated the skirt and lining as one when adding those pleats didn't really work well with the pocket. The top edge of the pocket is suspended by the tape and is trying to come up between those layers, and it splits them apart, so they don't want to lie very smoothly. It's not a huge deal, but I'm sure there's a better way I could have done that, but I can't think of one right now. And that's really it. Those are my only real criticisms. There are a few other minor things that I could have done better, like the pattern matching on the side seams. And for the mitered corner, I was definitely supposed to sew straight down, not at a 90-degree angle. But overall, I'm really happy with the turnout, and I'm excited to wear this jumper. I'm glad I got it done before the end of winter. Maybe I'll get some decent wear out of it before spring, but either way, I'll have it ready and waiting next fall. Anyways, thanks for watching. I've digitized the pattern that I made for this jumper, and it's currently getting size graded. I'll post it to the Patreon as soon as I get it back. If you want to take a whack at making your own pattern with your own refined bodice block, I've included all of those details in the video. I know it was a lot, but it could definitely be simplified. You could flatline the bodice, or you could leave the skirt unlined. Or if you don't have the time or confidence for that and just want a marked pattern to work with, well, that's what the Patreon's for. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can subscribe to me here on YouTube and follow my Instagram. And I have a separate YouTube channel if you're into writing and world building. See ya!